Okay, lesson 4 on the sixth topic. We're looking at something that's a little bit hmm, less discussed, but it should be, which is really the impact of what's known as the Solidarity movement in Poland for the decline of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. As we've seen in Hungary, Berlin, and Czechoslovakia, the Soviets are very good at keeping control by using excessive force or repressive tactics. The biggest challenge to the Soviets to this point will be what happens in Poland, and their response to it will be very telling about how the Soviets kept control and what limits there are on this control. Now, let's talk about Poland in 1980. The Polish government finds itself, like many of the other Eastern European states, short of money. It's forced to raise the price of goods to make up the shortfall in money, and at the same time, they don't increase the wages of the workers because they can't afford the increase in salaries. Therefore, extreme poverty grips Poland. People can't afford the higher priced goods, they're not making enough money, people start to starve, consumer goods, the economy shrinks. It's really a snowball effect of things. As a result, people start to strike against the government. And of course, why strike against the government? Well, of course, in an economy like the Soviet Union's and the eastern states, it is a government that controls everything, therefore they are the outlet for your anger. And as the strikes get larger and larger and larger, they will eventually grow into, not right away, but very soon, into a movement which gets the name of Solidarity, which means brotherhood. It's a trade union term, which if you keep solidarity, that you stick with your brothers and sisters for the greater good. Many people and many historians actually now look at solidarity as the beginning of the downfall. So in many ways, if you're looking at why the Soviet Union came apart when it did in the early 1990s, most people will say the writing was beginning to show, or the writing was beginning to be put on the wall with the solidarity movement in Poland beginning in the early 1980s. So what happened in 1980? So the 14th of August 1980, the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk, Poland goes on strike. Gdansk, Poland is an area right on the German border of Poland, and there's a very famous shipyard there. In fact, Gdansk, interestingly enough, was the first place that the Nazis crossed into Poland in their invasion in 1939. Gdansk, Poland is a important economic center for northwestern Poland, and in the huge shipyard there that built ships for all the countries in the Eastern Bloc, the workers there go on strike. They were, of course, angry, like everyone else in Poland, at the announced price rises, and they were also unhappy at the fact that several workers had been dismissed for complaining about the poor working conditions in the shipyards in Gdansk. They were led by a man named Lech Walesa. Lech Walesa was an electrician at the shipyard. He had no formal training other than being, of course, an electrician, but he was popular amongst his co-workers and sort of began to lead the call for those workers to demand a right to form a trade union. Now, you would think that perhaps trade union recognition and communism go hand in hand, and in essence they do, but the communists never saw trade unions as being necessary because, of course, all things were given to everybody equally, which was ultimately the goal of the trade union, and of course there was no capitalist working owner class, therefore there should be no right to a trade union. These guys want themselves to form a trade union, sort of to complain about and fight for better working conditions and better wages, amongst other things. The strike at the Gdansk shipyards lasts a week before the Communist Party negotiators arrive, and they begin talks with Walesa's strike committee. The communist government actually does a lot to try and hide the fact that the people in the Poland's largest shipyard are striking. They cut the telephone lines, they censor news reports, but actually the word gets out. And the strikers start to get letters of support. Some people even go up to Gdansk to try and throw their weight behind and support behind the striking workers. And by the time negotiations come around, the striking workers start to feel that they have national support, and they draw up a list of 21 demands, not only for the shipyard itself, but for communism and the government of Poland. And I'll let you read the demands of the strikers, but I have to actually boiled down to the 8 most important, at least the 8 that are the most consequential, okay? Acceptance of free trade unions, a right to strike, a day of rest on Sunday, a decreased waiting time for apartments. You'll have to understand that all things in the communist economy are controlled. You just can't go let an apartment that you like. You have to apply for an apartment, and then the party will assign you one. The waiting list for apartments in some cases could be up to 4 years, in which points you have young families living in small, crowded places with their parents, and some are really difficult situation because the supply far outstrips the demand far outstrips the supply, and the communists aren't building their economy effectively to distribute the needed provisions to the people who are working it. So I'll let you take a look, but you look at things like food products and the wait list for apartments, and you get an idea that the people in Poland are really finding that life within the Soviet bloc is completely undesirable. They just don't have access to what we consider normal things. So by the 31st of August 1980, it looks like the strikers have won. They reached an agreement with the Soviet negotiators that met some of the 21 demands. It gave workers the right to form unions, and these unions could be independent from government control. 2 weeks later, as a result of this, an independent trade union calling itself Solidarity is established, and it really takes the name from the movement, and it becomes a real symbol of a reforming Poland. However, of course, as people start to join Solidarity, I think Solidarity gets like 2 million members in a very, very short period of time. The Soviets again start to worry that perhaps things are getting out of hand. Perhaps this little bit of reform that they allowed the people of Czechoslovakia will go too far. And fearing, of course, that it will get out of hand, on the 13th of December 1981, the government will call a state of emergency. And Solidarity, which had lasted for just a little over a year, is suspended and not allowed to exist as an organization anymore in Poland. However, in this early bit between 1980 and 1981, Solidarity had seemed to, for the longest period of time, institute a degree of reform where others had failed. Others had failed in Hungary, others had failed in Czechoslovakia, but for at least a year and a half, Solidarity had seemed to have got to where others hadn't. And then there are really 4 reasons for this. Okay, the first one is organization. The movement had a committee, had its spokespeople like Lech Walesa, who were charismatic and popular, and it even had a newspaper called the Solidarność, which spread their message and made it more accessible to people all over Poland. Number 2 is their demands. The 21 demands weren't actually just for the workers; they were national demands, and because they were national demands, people were able across Poland to support some, if not all, of what the Solidarity strikers were asking for. Their methods, of course, the movement is really careful not to use violence like they tried in Czechoslovakia and Hungary, because they knew that harsh punishments and communist aggression would follow if they showed that they were going to become a militant rebel group. And as a result, they are very careful to become non-violent, so to sort of not give the Soviets a reason to attack. Also, too, support. I said 2 million before, but it's actually 10 million people from all aspects of Polish life actually joined Solidarity. This is 80% of the workforce of Poland. Also, it's also popular in industries that are crucial to the government. So one of the reasons that the Soviets sort of let it be is they're not willing to disturb the economy at a time when the Soviet government is actually struggling economically. One of the reasons the Soviets in the 1980s are perhaps in a little bit less of a shape to deal with Solidarity, or to be harsh with Solidarity, is that the economy is poor, and they need to keep these people working in order to prop up the Soviet economy to some degree. Now, because Solidarity is getting representation in all of the major industries, the government is less likely to act, but eventually they have to. As I said, by December 1981, they have to step in. A couple other things you could add, and this is really interesting. You want to show off to the examiner and say, hey, why did Solidarity take off? Here are some really important points. Solidarity is supported by the Catholic Church. The people of Polish are very Roman Catholic, and it's a strong and powerful influence in the country. Very important to note that the Pope is Pope John Paul the 23rd, or rather, Pope John Paul the 22nd, or no, Pope John Paul II. Why do I keep saying 20? Pope John Paul II, and Pope John Paul II is Polish, and he is the first Polish Pope, and he is enormously popular. And he's voicing from the Vatican, which has an incredibly strong influence worldwide, and putting pressure on the Soviet government to leave Solidarity alone, because he's voicing his support for the Solidarity movement. So any attack on Solidarity would be seen as an attack on the Catholic Church. The government is also playing for time. So the Soviets are hoping that the Solidarity movement would split into rival factions and it would draw up martial law plans in case it got out of hand. One of the things that's very common in revolutionary groups is the fact that they don't get along insofar as they always seem to argue about how much revolution that they want. You always have your radicals. I want crazy amounts of revolution. Let's throw over the government and kill everybody right now. And you have others who are like, let's just take our time. We'll do this slowly and properly as not to drop support. And the Soviet government saw that Solidarity, even though it was well organized, was having splits in the movement. And it was hopeful, like many other revolutionary movements across the world, and it's almost always happens, that it would split amongst itself into rival factions. So they were playing for time and hoping this would happen, and when it split, they would be able to say something like, hey, look, these guys are crazy, we need to step in. And lastly, the West supported Solidarity. Unlike in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, where the West was preoccupied, in Hungary they were preoccupied with the Suez Crisis, and in Czechoslovakia they were preoccupied with the Vietnam Crisis or the Vietnam War. The West wasn't preoccupied in 1980 and 1981, and they supported the Solidarity movement. Not only that, it got widespread media coverage around the world. Therefore, the Soviets decided to act pretty cautiously, not to antagonize the West. Not to mention, if they antagonize the West and threaten war over Poland with the Western states, they're in no position in 1980 to go to war over Poland. As I mentioned before, the economy is really poor in Poland and across the Soviet bloc in the 1980s, and it would be they would be at a tremendous disadvantage in any particular war, and therefore they are not keen to antagonize the West. So what is the government reaction overall? Let's analyze what the government does, okay? The government first believed that by issuing reforms, they would be able to calm the situation and let it sort of, die down so slowly the government could reassert control. In February 1981, the Polish Prime Minister, who had allowed the Solidarity movement to negotiate relatively good terms, resigned, and he was replaced by a new Prime Minister of Poland, a man named Wojciech Jaruzelski, who was the former head of the army. And for most people, the fact that the head of the army was coming in seemed to signify that he would send in the tanks, just like he had done in Hungary and Poland, especially after Solidarity claimed to be fighting for the rights of all people in the Eastern Bloc. So Solidarity started to get a big head and started to say that, we're more than a Polish organization. We may be fighting for rights in Poland, but we're hopeful to influence control of the Eastern Bloc. Instead, Jaruzelski invites Lech Walesa to meet and discuss his potential role in the new government. And a lot of people are hopeful. But of course, like all good Soviet agents, these discussions are a cover. Jaruzelski had no real intention of working with Lech Walesa. After about 9 months of posturing and tense negotiations, which really amounted to nothing, they broke down. As a result of the breakdown of negotiations and the fact that they couldn't get Solidarity to work within the frame of the government, the Soviet leader Brezhnev, now a very old and aging Brezhnev, orders the Red Army to conduct training maneuvers on the Polish border. And that's effectively a threat. So he's going to order the Soviet army to be on the border of Poland to do some training exercises, which is well known to mean that if you step out of line, we're going to roll this Red Army right over you. As a result, Jaruzelski, feeling that the Soviets are about to take charge and do what they had done in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, which he does want to avoid, needs to act. He makes up the fact that he had recordings of Solidarity planning a coup, okay? He had probably recordings of Solidarity, but Solidarity wasn't necessarily planning a coup. But he makes up the fact that he believes that on these videos, on these recorded tapes, that they're going to plan, and they are trying to plan an overthrow of the Polish government. So he proclaims martial law. Martial law is effectively this. All rights of citizens are suspended. There's a curfew. People can only go to work and come back home. You can be arrested in martial law without any sort of recourse for any reason. People's houses can be searched without reason. People can be jailed without reason. All it means is it's a way of the government exerting control and getting around any sort of laws that happen to exist. And as a result, Solidarity is outlawed, and the army arrests most of Solidarity's leaders, including Lech Walesa. Yeah, and lastly, the army arrests most of Solidarity's leaders, including Lech Walesa, and they throw them all in jail. Now, why did the Soviets decide after a year and a half to step in and essentially crush Solidarity? There are a couple reasons. Solidarity starts to act like a political party. Okay, the government declares that its secret tapes of Solidarity meeting to set up a new provisional government without the Communist Party, and they started to fear that the Solidarity was gone beyond just a union representing workers' rights. It was moving into the realm of politics and was trying to take over the government. There's probably a slight element of that is true, but certainly the tapes themselves are known to have been embellished for the purpose of the government so that they can impose martial law and crush Solidarity. Secondly, Poland is sinking into chaos. Almost all Poles felt the impact of the food shortages, rationing had been introduced, and wages didn't keep up with inflation. And therefore, the government needed to reassert control before open rebellion broke out. And third, Solidarity itself is tumbling into chaos. Okay, as I had started to mention, the Soviets were waiting for this to happen, and of course, Solidarity itself does start to sort of lead this way. Okay, there are many different factions within the Solidarity movement. Some felt the way to make progress was to push the communists harder until they cracked. Strikes continued long after Solidarity leadership had ordered them stopped, and people started to not listen to the leadership, and it started to be a movement that was sort of getting out of hand at the ground level. Even Solidarity seemed impossible for them to control. Lastly, it's to prevent Soviet invasion. Brezhnev had seen enough, and he had put his troops on the border, and the Poles basically knew that if they didn't intervene to stop Solidarity, the Soviets would. And this really, more than anything, forced Jaruzelski to intervene to crush Solidarity when he did in 1981. So what are the consequences of the 1980-81 strikes on Soviet control? Well, three things are obvious. First, the Polish people no longer trusted the communist leadership. The only thing that kept the communists in power was the force or threat backed up by the USSR. When Jaruzelski finally decided to use force, Solidarity is easily crushed. And lastly, if force wasn't used, then communist control seemed very shaky. So there's a real big lesson here that if the Soviets can't really keep control unless they use force. And not only that, they're becoming increasingly unpopular. So what consequences does this all have for Poland? So things stayed pretty much repressed until 1985. The Solidarity leaders remained in jail, et cetera, et cetera. And then in 1985, a man comes to power in the Soviet Union named Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev is a communist. He doesn't want to end the Soviet system, but he realizes that the Soviet system is flawed. The empire itself is outdated. And he would issue a series of reforms aimed at changing the terrible economic situation across the Eastern Bloc and in the Soviet Union. He called these reforms Glasnost and Perestroika, which stand for openness, an openness to change and reform, and Perestroika, restructuring, which is a change in the nature of the Soviet economy to make it a little bit more capitalistic, not necessarily totally capitalistic, but allow the Soviet economy to sort of rebuild itself, because the communist system as it had been established wasn't working. In connection with all of this, and particularly the notion of openness, the political prisoners, including those connected with Solidarity, were released in 1985. So therefore, Lech Walesa, who had been in jail since around Christmas 1981, is released in 1985. All of this put together was juxtaposed or put in the context of the fact that by 1988 the economic situation in Poland hadn't been improving. The Soviets had used repression, Glasnost and Perestroika hadn't worked quickly enough to reform the Soviet economy, and by 1988 the economy was worse than ever. And in 1988, of course, like it had been in 1980, strikes began to spread across the country. Okay, and again, this is connected with a massive increase in the price of food. A 40% increase in the price of food while wages stay the same led a lot of Poles to worry about the threat of starvation. The government decided to negotiate to end the strikes again with Solidarity, and they met Lech Walesa to find a way to end the strikes. By April 1989, Solidarity negotiates a deal with the government, which again legalizes the union and allows it to field candidates in upcoming elections. And this is again is in an effort to end the strikes, which are continuing. And when they held the elections to see what's going to happen, Solidarity won every seat it contested in Parliament. The communist candidate failed to gather enough support to form a government, and a man named Tadeusz Mazowiecki, a member of Solidarity, was elected as Prime Minister of Poland. So, as part of the consequence of the 1988 strikes, the government agrees to hold fair or free elections, and Solidarity runs and wins almost every seat. As a result, the first non-communist Prime Minister of Poland since 1945 is elected, and it's the first anywhere else in the Eastern Bloc for a period of 40 years. Under Mazowiecki, a Solidarity-led government was formed, and only Jaruzelski remained of the old regime. So Poland moves quite quickly from 1988 to April 1989 into a reform system. And this, of course, leads to what would eventually be Poland breaking away from the Eastern Bloc. So the significance of Solidarity is obviously massive. The strikers, once they realized that the Soviets weren't willing to use force in the late 1980s, were able to take their popular support and keep pressure on the government to allow fair elections, which eventually led to the removal of the Communist Party. And the significance of Solidarity in itself is fivefold. Number one, it highlights the failure of communism to provide good living standards. Of course, this undermines communism's claim to being a system which benefits ordinary people. It highlights the inefficiency and corruption of the Soviet system. It shows there are organizations which are now capable of resisting communist government. It also shows that a communist government could be threatened by people power. If a Soviet policy were to change, then a communist control would not survive. And we'll talk about that. When we look at Gorbachev. And the Soviet policy, if it were to change, is if the Soviets aren't willing to use force, then communist control can't survive in the Eastern Bloc. So Solidarity, a relatively long and developed movement, somewhat complex, and there is some stuff to remember here. And this is an important thing to actually try and commit to memory and study. You got to know the difference, what happened in 80 and 81, what happened in 89 and 88 and 89, and know those as two different things. But Solidarity is massively significant, and probably rightly, as most historians conclude, this is the beginning of the end for the Soviet control of Eastern Europe, and for that matter, the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union.